What if we could live on Jupiter? Not everyone who looks at the night sky truly understands what they're seeing. When we lift our eyes on a clear night, when darkness embraces the earth and the urban lights finally fall silent, our eyes capture a golden light that shines with hypnotizing intensity in the black fabric of the cosmos. For most people, it's just another bright dot lost among thousands of others. But for those who truly comprehend what they are contemplating, that light represents something far more disturbing and magnificent. We see Jupiter, the Colossus, the undisputed king of our solar system, a gas titan that governs the cosmos with its absolutely incomprehensible mass. 3 Jupiter hangs in the cosmic vacuum. Just this gas giant has no solid ground for human feet to touch. It has no liquid water oceans where terrestrial life can thrive. It has no breathable air, no bearable temperature, or any of the basic conditions we associate with habitability. Its atmosphere is a deadly symphony of hydrogen and helium, compressed to pressures that would turn any living being into molecular paste in a matter of seconds. Jovian winds reach speeds of the Great Red Spot. Just one of these storms has twice the diameter of Earth. It's a hurricane that could swallow our entire world and still have room left over. And it's just one of hundreds of similar storms that circulate through the Jovian atmosphere like ancient gods dancing through a cosmic ballroom of destruction. But it is in Jupiter's depths that its true hostility reveals itself. As we descend through its atmospheric layers, the pressure increases exponentially. 1,000 miles below the upper clouds, the pressure is already 10 times greater than at the bottom of the deepest terrestrial oceans. At 2,000 miles deep, it would be enough to compress diamonds into dust. And we keep going down. In Jupiter's core, if such a concept makes sense in a gaseous world, the pressures are millions of times greater than anything experienced on the terrestrial surface, so extreme that hydrogen itself behaves like liquid metal, conducting electricity through currents that generate the most powerful magnetic field in the solar system. This magnetic field is simultaneously a marvel and a nightmare. It captures charged particles from the solar wind and accelerates them to speeds close to the speed of light, creating radiation belts that extend for millions of miles around the planet. The radiation emanating from these regions would kill a human astronaut in a matter of minutes, even inside a spacecraft with the most advanced shielding we can build. Jupiter's moons orbit through these radiation belts like whales swimming through an ocean of invisible death. Europa, Io, Ganymede, Callisto, worlds that could potentially harbor life, are constantly bombarded by radiation levels that would sterilize any known organism. And yet, despite all this cosmic hostility, despite every aspect of Jupiter seeming specifically designed to make life impossible, there is a question that has haunted the human mind since we first understood the true nature of this impossible giant. What if, instead of just studying it through telescopes and robotic probes that are crushed in its atmospheres like insects against cosmic windshields, we decided to do something absolutely insane? What if we decided to call it home? What if we could, through some impossible alchemy of science and determination, transform the most hostile known world in the solar system into the cradle of a new humanity? The question seems absurd. It seems to violate not only the laws of physics and biology, but also basic common sense. How could a species that evolved on gentle African plains, that needs mild temperatures, breathable air, liquid water, and protection from radiation, even dream of inhabiting a world that represents the absolute opposite of everything that makes life possible? And yet, the question persists. It echoes through the corridors of research labs, resonates in the minds of scientists who spend their careers studying impossible exoplanets, and whispers through the dreams of explorers who look at the sky and refuse to accept that some places in the universe are permanently forbidden to human consciousness. This isn't just a story about survival in extreme conditions. It's not a scientific fantasy about traditional space colonization. It's a story about something much deeper and more disturbing, about the limits of human identity itself. It's a story about the absolutely absurd stubbornness of a species that has refused throughout its entire evolutionary history to accept that some places, some conditions, some challenges are forever impossible. A species that looked at oceans that seemed infinite and built boats, that contemplated skies that seemed unreachable and invented airplanes, that studied diseases that killed millions and discovered cures, that observed literally indivisible atoms and learned to divide them. A species that now looks at Jupiter with its planet-sized storms, its pressures that would crush mountains, its radiation that kills in minutes, and whispers the most dangerous and beautiful question of all. What if? This is a journey through the most radical transformations our biology, our technology, our psychology, and our very soul could endure. An exploration of the most extreme territories of deliberate evolution, where the line between human and something completely new dissolves into possibilities that defy our current understanding of what it means to be conscious, to be creative, to be human. It's a story about limits, and about the discovery that every limit we think is absolute may just be a disguised invitation to transcendence, because maybe, in the end, the question isn't, can we live on Jupiter, but rather, what will we discover about ourselves when we try? If this kind of content sparks your imagination and faith, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who loves exploring the mysteries of the universe. The first lesson Jupiter teaches those audacious enough to try to inhabit it is simple and absolute. Life, as we know and understand it, simply stops, not gradually, not with warnings or periods of adaptation, instantly, completely, like a candle being snuffed out by a cosmic hurricane. When the first biomedical engineers began to seriously contemplate the possibility of human survival on Jupiter, they quickly discovered they were facing not an engineering problem, but a complete reframing of the fundamental principles that govern biological existence. It wasn't a matter of creating better protective equipment. It was a matter of completely redefining what protection meant when every aspect of the environment was simultaneously lethal in different ways. The first suits designed for Jovian survival were not equipment in the traditional sense. They weren't advanced spacesuits. They weren't mere improvements on existing technologies. They were hybrid organisms, living entities that existed on the border between biology and technology, between the organic and the artificial, between what is human and what is something completely new. Imagine biofabric that not only protects, but lives, breathes, adapts, and evolves in real time. Each fiber of these suits was composed of genetically modified nanoorganisms, microscopic creatures specifically designed to thrive in conditions that would kill any known natural life form. These organisms wove a flexible armor around the human body, creating not a static barrier between our fragility and the gas giant's fury, but a dynamic and responsive interface. The suit wasn't worn, it was grown. The process of donning a Jovian suit took weeks as the nanoorganisms gradually colonized the user's skin, establishing symbiotic connections with bodily systems, integrating with the nervous, circulatory, and respiratory systems until the distinction between biological body and technological protection became meaningless. This second skin pulsed with a life of its own. You could literally feel your heartbeat synchronizing with the suit's metabolic rhythms. You could feel your breathing being processed through organisms that converted Jupiter's toxic atmosphere into breathable oxygen through biochemical processes that defied traditional biochemistry. The suit's respiratory system was a marvel of bioengineering that made photosynthesis seem simple. Biochemical filters composed of colonies of modified bacteria processed the Jovian atmosphere. 89% hydrogen, it was a closed loop of mutual dependence. The suit kept the human alive. The human provided body heat and nutrition that kept the suit running. Together, they formed a single hybrid organism capable of thriving where each individual component would die instantly. The conductive fibers woven into the living fabric regulated temperature through biological thermostatic processes. In the upper layers of the Jovian atmosphere, where temperatures drop to, but perhaps more impressive than the thermal regulation, was the neural sensory system. Bioelectronic sensors integrated directly into the user's nervous system, transforming the suit into a literal extension of the body itself. It wasn't like wearing equipment. It was like growing new sensory organs. Through these neural connections, users could feel the Jovian atmosphere as a new sense. They could detect pressure variations through tactile sensations, perceive changes in atmospheric composition as alterations in taste, and navigate through the Jovian magnetic fields as if they were currents of water that could be felt but not seen. The visual system was completely revolutionary. Jupiter's dense atmosphere makes traditional vision impossible beyond a few feet away. The suit compensated through an augmented reality built by sensors that mapped the environment through echolocation, atmospheric radar, magnetic detection, and spectral analysis. The Jovian world was revealed to the colonists as landscapes of colors and textures that never existed in the terrestrial experience. Atmospheric currents appeared as rivers of light flowing through three-dimensional space. Magnetic fields manifested as brilliant geometric patterns that changed shape as the user moved. Distant storms were visible as explosions of colorful energy on the horizon. Their electromagnetic frequencies translated into terrifyingly beautiful visual spectacles. But living inside this biotechnological shell required psychological adaptations that no terrestrial training could prepare for. Sensory isolation was absolute and total. No direct human touch was possible, only contact mediated through synthetic materials, no natural smell, no unprocessed taste, none of the tactile sensations that define terrestrial human intimacy. The first colonists discovered that Jupiter tested not only their bodies, but their minds and souls. The constant sensory isolation created a unique form of existential claustrophobia, not a fear of confined spaces, but a terror of being forever separated from direct contact with reality. Being always connected to the suit, always dependent on it for every vital function, began to blur the lines between where the human being ended and where the machine began. Users reported dreams where they couldn't distinguish between their own thoughts and the suit's. Computational processes, moments of panic where they weren't sure if a decision had been made by their human mind or by integrated artificial intelligence systems. To maintain their sanity, they developed new rituals that would challenge any terrestrial concept of normalcy. Synchronized meditations through shared neural interfaces, where multiple users connected their minds through the suit's systems, creating a primitive form of temporary collective consciousness. Collective dances that only made sense in the context of Jovian gravity. Forms of communication based on vibrations transmitted through the suits created a completely new language. Words became unnecessary when emotions, memories, and complex concepts could be shared directly through frequency patterns. Conversations transformed into symphonies of sensation that transcended the limitations of traditional vocabulary. Humanity's first victory over Jupiter came with an unexpected and profound price, the complete redefinition of what it meant to be human. Success in surviving in the most hostile environment known forced an evolution not just technological, but philosophical. Who were these beings that could thrive where traditional humans would die instantly? Still human, or something new entirely? It was just the beginning of a journey that would challenge every assumption about identity, consciousness, and the very meaning of life. The suit had given humanity an opportunity to survive on Jupiter, but survival was not enough. Not for a species that dreams of eternity, that refuses to accept limitations as permanent, that looks at impossibility and whispers, "What if?" The next phase would demand something even more radical, the complete abandonment of protective barriers and the embrace of transformation at the most fundamental biological level possible. The next phase of Jovian colonization required something that no civilization in known history had ever seriously contemplated: the deliberate and conscious reconstruction of the human species itself, not improvement, not enhancement, not superficial modifications or incremental adaptations. A transformation so profound and fundamental that it would challenge our very definition of what it means to be biologically human. A metamorphosis that would make the evolution of amphibians into reptiles seem like a trivial cosmetic change. The bioevolutionary scientists who studied the data collected during the first years of colonization with suits came to a conclusion that was simultaneously liberating and terrifying. To truly live on Jupiter, not just survive protected as a permanently encapsulated astronaut, but organically inhabit this gaseous world as fish inhabit oceans, would require a transformation that would make our terrestrial ancestors see us as completely unrecognizable aliens. Human blood, that red fluid that carries life through terrestrial arteries and veins, would be completely inadequate for Jovian physiology. Under pressures that could crush diamonds and temperatures that vary between extremes, that would vaporize water or freeze it instantly, traditional blood would simply cease functioning as a transporter of oxygen and nutrients. The solution required a breakthrough in biochemistry that redefined our understanding of how life can work. A circulatory fluid based on liquid biosynthetic silicone, enriched with nanoparticles specially designed to transport breathable gases, even under conditions that would make normal blood boil, coagulate, or simply stop responding to cardiac pressure. This Jovian blood would have a viscosity slightly denser than terrestrial blood and would shine with a subtle golden tone when seen through modified translucent skin. More importantly, it would not only survive Jovian conditions, it would be enhanced by them. High pressures would increase its transport efficiency. Electromagnetic fields would improve its capacity to deliver nutrients to cells. It was as if the Jovian body were designed specifically to thrive exactly where terrestrial bodies should fail catastrophically. Human skin, that thin and vulnerable membrane that protects us from gentle terrestrial elements, would become completely obsolete. In its place, a crystalline biofilm would grow from the body itself during the adaptation process, not something applied externally, but an evolution of the skin itself that emerged from the inside out over months of carefully controlled transformation. This new skin would shine with iridescent golden reflections, like living liquid metal that changed tonality according to angles of light and movement. Each cell of this biofilm would not only resist the extreme conditions of Jupiter, atmospheric pressures that would crush terrestrial bones, temperatures that would vaporize body fluids, radiation that would cook cells in seconds, but would process these apparent threats as forms of nutrition and energy. What should be deadly corrosion would literally become food for the skin. Extreme pressure would be converted into mechanical energy that powered cellular processes. Radiation that should destroy DNA would be processed through mechanisms that used quantum effects to enhance cellular repair instead of causing damage. The texture would be simultaneously familiar and alien, soft to the touch like human skin, but with a resistance that could stop projectiles. Flexible as fabric, but impermeable to any known compound, and it had an almost magical characteristic: instant self-repair. Any damage to the surface would be immediately repaired by cells that literally multiplied in response to trauma, using the very agents causing the damage as raw material for regeneration. Human lungs, designed to process Earth's atmosphere rich in oxygen and nitrogen, would be completely re-architected into something that transcended traditional concepts of respiration. Instead of alveoli that exchanged oxygen for carbon dioxide, new respiratory organs would function as complex internal biodistilleries with multiple specialized chambers. The first chamber would filter and neutralize the most dangerous toxins from the Jovian atmosphere. The second would break down hydrogen molecules into their elemental components. The third would reconstitute these elements into breathable compounds, adequate for Jovian metabolism. The fourth would process trace gases and convert them into liquid nutrients that would be distributed directly to the circulatory system. Breathing would become a conscious and controlled process, no longer an automatic reflex, but a deliberate activity where each inspiration would be a decision to transform the Jovian atmosphere into vital energy. The process would be simultaneously meditative and practical, a form of bioalchemy where the act of converting atmospheric poison into life would become a profound spiritual practice. The skeletal system would evolve into something that would appear alien to terrestrial observers, but that would be perfectly adapted to Jovian reality. Bones would become porous and tubular structures filled with pressurized fluid that would function as biological shock absorbers against extreme atmospheric pressure. More compact than terrestrial skeletons, more dense, but also paradoxically more flexible, as if each bone were made of living titanium bamboo, structures that could bend significantly without breaking under pressures that would crush terrestrial bones like paper. Each bone would be filled with fluid that was not just structural but also functional, serving as an additional reservoir of nutrients and a distribution system for body heat. The spinal column would become more robust and flexible, with vertebrae that could compress and expand according to variations in atmospheric pressure, allowing Jovians to literally breathe through their bone structure. The sensory organs would undergo the most radical and impressive transformations. Human eyes, designed to process visible light, reflected in a transparent atmosphere, would be useless in the Jovian environment where atmospheric density makes traditional vision impossible beyond a few feet. New visual organs would develop as complex multispectral systems with multiple layers of protection and functionality. Bio-cultivated crystal corneas, transparent as diamond but flexible as organic tissue, would protect irises that would function as adaptive spectral filters, changing configuration according to vision necessities. Behind them, completely redesigned retinas would be capable of processing not only infrared light and thermal radiation, but also radiation in spectrums that terrestrial eyes never evolved to detect. They would see heat as we see colors, perceive atmospheric convection currents as dynamic visual patterns and fluids, and detect pressure variations as changes in brightness and saturation. A Jovian looking at a Jovian storm would see not just chaotic movement, but beautiful, mathematical patterns of energy flow and mass distribution. Storms would appear as visual symphonies of thermodynamics, where each turbulence, each pressure variation, each electromagnetic fluctuation would be visible as colors and shapes that dance through space, in patterns that revealed the underlying physical laws governing atmospheric dynamics. More profoundly, the nervous system would be completely reprogrammed to interpret stimuli that would be unbearable for terrestrial beings. What would register as agonizing pain for a terrestrial human would become simply processable sensory information for a Jovian. Extreme pressure, just an interesting texture indicating the proximity of energy sources. Radiation that should destroy cells? Simply a variation in background energy levels that suggested opportunities for cellular enhancement. Temperature extremes? Comfortable variations in environmental warmth. The result of this transformation would be a creature that maintains a consciousness, creativity, and curiosity that is fundamentally human, but in a body that terrestrial ancestors would not recognize as belonging to the same evolutionary tree. Beings of compact stature, with fluid and precise movements that recalled aquatic dance, skin that shone like liquid gold under any light, and a presence that radiated supernatural calm, as if they had made permanent peace with cosmic forces that should destroy them. Their faces would maintain recognizably humanoid structures, but with slightly different proportions. Larger eyes for better thermal capture, smaller noses because olfaction would be processed through other organs, and mouths that rarely opened because vocal communication would be obsolete. And when they smiled, because they still smiled, it would be with a serenity that comes from having completely transcended the fear of their own mortality, from having evolved beyond the biological limitations that once defined the human experience. This would be post-Jovian humanity, biologically unrecognizable, but still carrying the flame of curiosity, creativity, and beautiful stubbornness that defines our species. The question that began to haunt these new beings would be a profound and disturbing one. By saving our species through such a radical transformation, had we preserved our humanity, or had we become something else entirely? If you've made it this far, tell us in the comments. Would you live on Jupiter? And what city are you watching from? Let's chat in the comments. How do you build a daily life, a recognizable routine, a functional society on a world that has no solid ground, no visible sky, no point of reference that a terrestrial human mind can comprehend as normal? How do you live, genuinely live, not just survive, on a planet where basic concepts like up and down are relative? Where time is measured not by the movement of stars, but by electromagnetic cycles, where home is a concept that must be completely redefined because traditional architecture is literally impossible. Jovian cities exist as miracles of bioengineering that defy not only terrestrial physics, but also traditional concepts of urban planning and community design. These are not settlements built on solid ground. They are floating habitats suspended in specific atmospheric currents where a precise combination of pressure, temperature, and electromagnetic field strength allows semi-permanent structures to exist without being instantly crushed, dissolved, or swept away by winds that move faster than terrestrial hurricanes. These aerial metropolises are not built. They are grown, cultivated through processes that combine traditional architecture with agricultural techniques and biological engineering. Each city is simultaneously an organism and a construction, a living entity that responds dynamically to atmospheric conditions while providing a stable environment for its inhabitants. Imagine translucent structures that glow with an internal golden light, like cathedrals of living glass, suspended in clouds that change color as atmospheric composition shifts. Each building is made of crystalline materials, extracted and processed directly from the Jovian atmosphere itself. Substances that literally breathe, that adapt to pressure changes, that process atmospheric gases as nutrients. The walls of these structures are not static barriers, but living membranes that continuously interact with the Jovian environment. They absorb atmospheric gases, process toxins, generate oxygen, regulate internal temperature, and provide structural support that adjusts automatically to external pressures that would crush traditional buildings instantly. Jovian architecture follows principles completely different from any terrestrial building tradition. without extreme gravity to combat, without solid foundations to anchor, without the limitations of traditional materials, constructions grow in complex three-dimensional spirals that take advantage of natural atmospheric currents for support. Each building is designed as an aerodynamic organism that not only resists high-altitude winds, but harnesses them as an energy source. Structural elements capture wind energy and convert it into electrical power that feeds the building's biological systems. It's as if each structure were a giant windmill that not only generates power, but uses it to maintain its own metabolism. Food became a form of organic alchemy that would seem miraculous to terrestrial observers. Jovians do not cultivate food in the traditional sense. They literally cultivate their nutrients directly from the atmosphere through personal bioreactors that are simultaneously technological tools and external body organs. Each Jovian has their own nutritional processing system, biological devices that grow and adapt to their specific metabolic needs. These reactors transform Jovian atmospheric components, hydrogen, helium, methane, ammonia, trace compounds, into complex organic molecules that provide not only basic nutrition, but also enhanced cognitive function and cellular repair. Jovian food looks more like crystalline structures that glow with internal light when properly prepared. Each nutritional crystal dissolves in the mouth, releasing not only physical sustenance, but controlled bursts of flavor, aroma, and even sensory experiences that can be programmed for specific effects. A Jovian could eat the memory of how a terrestrial fruit tasted or experience completely new flavors that never existed in any natural world. Even more impressively, they could program their meals to include specific emotional experiences. A crystal infused with compounds that induce serenity, another with substances that enhance creativity, and still another with elements that intensify empathetic connection with other Jovians. Locomotion through the Jovian environment had evolved into something more like controlled flight than traditional walking. Modified bodies could alter their internal density through conscious control of the pressurization of body fluids, becoming lighter than the dense atmosphere to float gently, or heavier to dive through gaseous layers with purpose and direction. They move like three-dimensional swimmers through an invisible atmospheric ocean, using convection currents as underwater streams that carry them through urban airspace. Groups of Jovians floating in formation through golden clouds create spectacles of synchronized movement that are simultaneously practical transportation and performance art. Watching a family of Jovians moving together through atmospheric layers, parents teaching children how to navigate pressure differentials, teenagers experimenting with advanced flight maneuvers, elderly individuals moving with a grace that comes from decades of practice, would be like watching a ballet performed in three-dimensional space by beings who had completely mastered the relationship between body density and atmospheric dynamics. Communication had completely transcended the need for vocal cords, tongues, or any speech apparatus that defines terrestrial human communication. Jovians developed a language based on controlled subsonic vibration patterns that travel through the dense atmosphere as invisible waves carrying complex meaning. A Jovian conversation sounds like a symphony of frequencies that could be simultaneously heard and felt, creating words that are simultaneously sound, physical sensation, and even aromatic experience. They could transmit not only basic information, but complete emotional states, vivid memories, complex abstract concepts, and even sensory experiences from one mind to another. Two beings conversing in Jovian shared much more than words. They temporarily shared aspects of their own consciousnesses, creating an intimacy of communication that would be impossible for terrestrial beings to imagine. It was as if each conversation was a light form of temporary mental fusion. Children learning Jovian communication developed abilities that would seem telepathic to terrestrial observers, but which were actually a sophisticated mastery of frequency modulation and atmospheric vibration control. The educational process was simultaneously language learning, musical training, and meditation practice. The most alien aspect of daily Jovian life was its completely transformed relationship with the concepts of time and space. Without visual access to the sun through perpetual clouds, without day-night cycles, without seasonal changes, without any temporal landmarks that define terrestrial experience, they developed biorhythms based on subtle variations of atmospheric pressure, temperature, and chemical composition. Day and night became completely internal and personalized concepts, defined by individual metabolic cycles rather than external illumination. Each Jovian developed their own circadian rhythm based on fluctuations in body temperature, neural activity, and nutritional processing cycles. A Jovian week might be measured by complete cycles of cellular regeneration. A month might correspond to REM sleep patterns. A year might be defined by atmospheric circulation cycles that affect entire communities simultaneously. But perhaps the most impressive aspect was how they preserved and transformed fundamentally human elements in ways that would challenge a terrestrial understanding of cultural continuity. They still created art, but sculpted using pressurized atmospheric vapor, literally molding toxic air into temporary forms that existed for weeks before dissolving naturally back into the atmosphere. They painted with suspended atmospheric particles, creating three-dimensional murals that floated in the air and changed shape according to natural wind patterns. Their paintings weren't static objects, but dynamic performances that evolved continuously, telling stories that developed over months or years. Jovian music was built from the natural harmonies of high-altitude winds and the frequencies of active volcanic moon activity. They learned to play the Jovian storms themselves as collective musical instruments, modulating atmospheric turbulence to create symphonies that echoed through entire hemispheres. We learned, they transmitted through their interplanetary communications, that home is not a place where we were born or where our bodies were originally designed to exist. It's a place that we choose to build through our refusal to accept limitations as final, even when everything in the universe conspires to destroy us. Jupiter taught us that life is not about finding adequate conditions. It's about becoming adequate for any condition we choose to embrace. Their daily existence had become living proof that consciousness, creativity, and community could not only survive, but flourish in conditions that should make life impossible. Each routine, activity, eating atmospheric compounds, floating through gaseous cities, communicating through frequency modulation, was a testimony to the limitless adaptability of the human spirit when faced with ultimate challenges. Are we still human? Or have we become something else entirely, carrying only genetic memories of a humanity that may never have really existed? This question haunts every transmission we receive from the modified Jovians, echoing through the vast atmospheric layers of Jupiter, like a melancholic frequency that never finds a satisfactory resolution. It is a question that haunts them constantly, a question for which they never find an answer that brings complete peace. This profound uncertainty does not emerge from abstract philosophical speculation. It comes from the lived experience of beings who remember, through carefully preserved genetic records, what had once been human existence, but who now experience reality through senses so transformed, through bodies so adapted, through a consciousness so altered that the terrestrial experience seems like mythology. The Jovians maintain meticulous biochemical records of their terrestrial origins, detailed genetic archives that preserve every DNA sequence, every evolutionary marker, every trait that connects them to terrestrial humanity. But this information has begun to seem more like emotional archaeology than lived personal history, like fossils of feelings they once experienced, but which they can now only study intellectually. Think about the fundamental human experiences that define our emotional landscape: physical pain, temperature sensation, taste, touch, smell, sound. For Jovians, every single one of these experiences had been completely transformed through biological adaptation that made Jovian existence possible. They do not feel pain in the same way we felt on Earth. What should be unbearable agony, atmospheric pressure that crushes bones, radiation that cooks cellular tissue, chemical exposure that dissolves organic matter, registers in their modified nervous systems only as variations in processable sensory data, information that can be analyzed, categorized, and responded to, but never genuinely feared. This absence of physical fear created a profound psychological shift. The fear of death, which motivates so much of terrestrial human behavior and creativity, simply no longer exists. When you cannot be easily destroyed by your environment, when your body is genuinely adapted to prosper where it should die, mortality becomes an abstract concept rather than a constant existential pressure. They do not experience hunger as a painful contraction in the stomach, as a physical emptiness that demands urgent attention. Instead, nutritional need manifests as a subtle decrease in biofilter efficiency, a gentle mental indicator that resources need to be processed. It's like the difference between desperate thirst and simply noticing that the fuel tank is getting low. Temperature sensation had also been completely redefined. Jovians do not feel cold or hot in ways that terrestrial beings understand these concepts. Atmospheric temperatures that would freeze terrestrial blood solid or vaporize tissue register only as interesting variations in environmental conditions. Comfortable variability rather than threatening extremes. Love, anger, hope, melancholy. All these emotions still exist in the Jovians, but filtered through neurochemistries that function with compounds derived from the Jovian atmosphere, processed by brains that evolved to find beauty in chaos and harmony in destruction. Jovian love does not include the direct physical touch that defines terrestrial intimacy. There are no kisses, embraces, caresses, or any of the tactile expressions that terrestrial beings associate with deep affection. Instead, they share neural frequencies, synchronize subsonic vibrations, and create collaborative atmospheric patterns that express intimacy in ways that terrestrial bodies could never experience or comprehend. Jovian anger does not manifest as muscle tension, an adrenaline rush, or any of the physical responses we know. It becomes a form of art, controlled atmospheric disturbances that a Jovian can create around themselves, vapor patterns that express frustration through complex shapes and movements. It is anger transformed into a temporary gaseous sculpture. What most profoundly impacts their communications is how they describe nostalgia, an emotion that became simultaneously more intense and more abstract. They feel a deep longing for sensations that their transformed bodies can no longer experience. The coolness of a terrestrial breeze touching unprotected skin, the smell of grass after rain penetrating nostrils that processed air without filtration, the sensation of sand between fingers that could feel texture directly. But these longings became like missing a song they never learned to play, or dreaming of colors that never existed. They are real and profound, but fundamentally disconnected from any experience they could have again. It is nostalgia for a state of being that became biologically impossible for them. We conquered Jupiter, they transmit in their most intimate communications, but we lost the ability to feel the delicacy of a terrestrial flower dissolving between our fingers. We adapted so completely to the extreme that we forgot what it was like to be vulnerable. And there was a specific beauty in vulnerability, a poetry of fragility that we can never again recover or even completely understand. They developed elaborate rituals to maintain a connection with lost terrestrial sensations. Meditations where they imagine how it should feel to experience cold, mental exercises where they attempt to reconstruct the experience of breathing unprocessed air, and collective ceremonies where they simulate through shared neural frequencies what might have been direct physical touch. But these rituals serve more as melancholic reminders of what they became, rather than genuine connections to what they were. They are performances of lost humanity, reenactments of emotions that became theoretically understandable but experientially inaccessible. The most disturbing transformation is that they do not cry tears. Their modified eyes produce only a transparent, neutral fluid that keeps the crystal corneas clean and functional. There are no tears of joy, tears of sadness, tears of relief, or tears of grief. The most basic and universal physical expression of deep emotion simply no longer exists. Instead of tears, they express intense emotion through controlled alterations in the chemical composition of their bioluminescent skin. Sadness makes their golden skin darken to deeper tones of amber. Joy makes it glow more intensely. Grief makes it nearly opaque. It is beautiful in its own way, but fundamentally alien to any terrestrial observer. Perhaps there is no way back. Perhaps this is the inevitable nature of evolution when pushed far beyond all conceivable limits. Preserved consciousness, creativity, and the capacity to ask deep questions about existence and meaning, but lose the sensory and emotional context that originally gave poetic meaning to that consciousness. The Jovians still make art, still build deep relationships, still seek transcendence and purpose, but they do all this as beings who carry only an increasingly distant genetic memory of having been at one time vulnerable enough to be genuinely human. We adapted, they transmit through the cosmic emptiness. But in the process of conquering the most hostile environment imaginable, we discovered that the danger was not being destroyed by Jupiter. The danger was becoming so perfectly adapted that we forgot what made adaptation meaningful in the first place. This melancholic admission carries profound implications. The new Jovian humanity achieved something that seemed absolutely impossible, not just to survive, but to prosper in the most hostile environment imaginable. But the cost was a gradual disconnection from everything that historically defined human sensibility. Maybe this is simply the price of transcendence. Perhaps when consciousness pushes beyond all biological limitations, it necessarily leaves behind the emotional and sensory frameworks that originally gave meaning to conscious experience. But the question remains, echoing through the atmospheric layers like an unanswered frequency, in our determination to preserve human consciousness through the ultimate transformation. Which aspects of humanity proved truly essential? And which did we discover were merely temporary expressions of something much deeper and more mysterious? A civilization doesn't simply expire because it transforms beyond recognition. It is reborn with a different soul, carrying echoes of its origin, but singing completely new songs. The Jovians developed cultural rituals that would be utterly incomprehensible to terrestrial observers, but that carry profound and recognizable echoes of universal human impulses. The need to create beauty, preserve memory, celebrate existence, find meaning in impermanence, and connect individual consciousness to something larger than itself. They created an art form they call atmospheric literature. Complex patterns of controlled vapor that form three-dimensional symbols, suspended in the acidic air for weeks or months before dissolving naturally back into the atmosphere. Each book is a temporary gaseous formation that tells stories through shapes, densities, movements, and transformations that only Jovian bodies and minds can completely interpret. A single work of atmospheric literature can occupy volumes of airspace equivalent to terrestrial city blocks, constantly changing its configuration according to natural winds and atmospheric pressures. Reading one of these works is a process that can last months, as the reader, or multiple readers, collaboratively follows the narrative evolution through different atmospheric layers and climatic seasons. The most valuable stories are those that interact with the environment in unpredictable ways, where natural atmospheric events, storms, pressure variations, chemical changes become part of the developing narrative. It's as if the planet Jupiter itself were a co-author of each story, contributing elements that no individual writer could plan or control. These literary works serve not only as entertainment, but as historical records, philosophical texts, and communal memories. Stories that survive multiple atmospheric cycles become part of the cultural canon, preserved not through static recording, but through a dynamic interaction between human creativity and Jovian environmental forces. Their architecture evolved to be completely indistinguishable from performance art. Each building is simultaneously a functional shelter, a musical instrument, and a giant kinetic sculpture. Structures are designed to sing when the wind passes through them, creating urban symphonies that change according to atmospheric variations. An entire Jovian city can function as a single collective musical instrument, where different neighborhoods contribute different harmonic sections. During major atmospheric storms, entire cities play symphonic compositions that can be heard, or rather, felt through atmospheric vibrations at distances of thousands of miles. The process of urban planning becomes a form of collaborative composition where architects, musicians, atmospheric engineers, and community members work together to design settlements that are simultaneously functional, beautiful, and harmonically integrated with the Jovian environmental rhythms. Jovian music completely transcended the limitations of traditional instruments. They learned to play the active volcanic eruptions of Jovian moons as colossal percussive instruments, modulating tectonic activity through controlled vibration and directed atmospheric pressure to create harmonies that echo through entire continents. A Jovian musical performance can literally reshape geological landscapes. They orchestrate minor eruptions to create bass rhythms, manipulate lava flows to generate melodies, and coordinate volcanic gas releases to produce atmospheric harmonies that alter the very visual appearance of Jupiter's major moon surfaces when viewed by external observers. The most ambitious compositions are collaborative projects that involve multiple cities, coordinating geological activity across continental regions. These planetary concerts can last terrestrial years and are visible even from space, as patterns of volcanic activity create rhythms and melodies that alter the visual appearance of Jupiter's major moons. Jovian politics are based on the collective management of atmospheric resources. Without solid fixed territories to dispute, without traditional geographical boundaries, conflicts and community decisions arise over rights to access convection currents richest in minerals, over the distribution of the most nutritious vapors, over permissions to modify local weather patterns for artistic or architectural projects. They developed what could be called gaseous democracy, a political system where decisions are made through collective atmospheric formations that create a literally visible consensus in the air itself. When a Jovian community needs to make an important decision, they gather in formation and create vapor patterns that represent different options and levels of support. The voting process becomes a collaborative art form where the atmosphere itself records and manifests the collective will. Decisions are reached when atmospheric patterns stabilize in configurations that represent consensus, and these configurations are preserved as official records that can be read by any community member. Political discourse happens through the creation of temporary, atmospheric sculptures that represent different positions, arguments, and potential solutions. Complex policy debates manifest as elaborate gaseous constructions that evolve over time as community members contribute their perspectives through the manipulation of atmospheric elements. Most fascinating of all is how they preserved, transformed, and intensified concepts of spirituality and transcendence. The Jovians developed a religious philosophy based on perpetual transformation and existential alchemy. For them, the sacred is not in permanence or stability, but in the infinite capacity to convert destruction into creation, toxicity into nutrition, and hostility into hospitality. They see divinity directly manifested in the chemical processes that transform atmospheric poison into vital energy, in the mathematical equations that govern the dynamics of acidic fluid, and in the fractal patterns that emerge from reactions between compounds that should be mutually destructive. Their temples are temporary atmospheric formations, vapor sanctuaries that exist only during specific chemical events, when certain atmospheric conditions create patterns that they interpret as direct manifestations of the divine. Worship happens through conscious participation in these alchemical processes, where Jovians literally become part of the chemical reactions they venerate as sacred. Religious practice becomes a form of applied chemistry, where the faithful participate in atmospheric transformations that demonstrate the divine principle of creation through transformation. Prayer is not spoken words, but a conscious manipulation of atmospheric elements to create patterns that honor the creative force that makes life possible in conditions that should prevent existence. Original Earth, they transmit in their most poetic communications, is a golden dream we tell our children when they ask why our ancestors chose to live where everything should destroy us instantly. We describe blue skies that never became clouded, sweet oceans that didn't need to be neutralized before contact, and air that could be breathed directly without biochemical processing. They listen to these descriptions as we listen to terrestrial fairy tales, stories too beautiful to be real, worlds too perfect to exist. And yet, something fundamentally human not only persists, but intensifies and purifies through extreme transformation. The curiosity that originally brought them to Jupiter continues to drive them toward even more impossible challenges. They are already developing experimental technologies to adapt to the liquid ammonia oceans of other worlds, contemplating even more radical modifications to inhabit the atmospheres of gas giants, and exploring the possibility of colonizing environments that would make Jupiter seem hospitable. The human soul, it seems, not only refuses to accept limitations as final, it strengthens, purifies, and intensifies through each impossibility overcome, like metal being forged at extreme temperatures to become stronger than it could be under normal conditions. Jovian society had become living proof that consciousness, creativity, and community could not only survive ultimate challenges, but flourish and evolve into forms more beautiful and complex than anything possible under easier conditions. Their culture demonstrated that when the human spirit confronts absolute limits, it doesn't simply adapt, it transforms the limitations themselves into opportunities for transcendence. We were not made to survive on Jupiter. We were not made to breathe hydrogen, to withstand pressures that would turn our bones to dust, to resist radiation that would cook our cells in seconds. We were not made to live on a world where down and up are relative concepts, where storms last for centuries, and where silence does not exist because the planet itself screams constantly through electromagnetic frequencies. And yet, here we are, or at least here is something we once were. Jupiter is 88,8. This means that you, who are watching now are worth much more than this gigantic planet that defies all life. The Jovian journey taught us that humanity is not defined by the shape of our bodies, the composition of our blood, or the chemistry of our brains. It is defined by something more abstract and more powerful, by the absolute refusal to accept limitations as final. The modified Jovians, who float through the atmospheric layers of the gas giant, may not look like us, may not feel like us, and may not think like us, but they carry the same flame that led the first humans to leave the caves, to cross oceans, to look at the stars, and ask, "What if?" "For I know the plans I have for you," declares the Lord, "plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future." Jeremiah. Perhaps Jupiter will never be a true home for something that can be called human in the traditional sense, but the desire to inhabit it, the stubbornness to transform the impossible into the inevitable, has already led us beyond any limitation we thought was permanent. Somewhere in the depths of the Jovian atmosphere, beings who carry our genetic heritage dance among planet-sized storms, create art with auroras, and continue to ask the most human question of all: what comes next? And that question, echoing through the cosmos, may be the only truly immortal thing about our species. If you've made it this far, receive this blessing. You are a gem more precious than any star or planet. Write Amen, your name and your city in the comments. We will be praying for you so that God may pour out immeasurable blessings upon your life.